Hey, FirstSF. My name is Clark, and I had the pleasure of preaching this past Sunday in our Explore God series on the question of is Christianity too exclusive? This is the question that a lot of people have as an objection to the Christian religion and the faith because, as we looked at in John 14, Jesus says there, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And it can seem like a very exclusive claim to say that no one comes to the Father except through Christ. So apart from Jesus, everyone else is presumably on the Christian faith condemned to hell. And so with that, we looked at how Christianity is not actually exclusive, but radically inclusive. If you look at all the major religions back in Jesus' day and in our day, and even if you look at a secular view or worldview, all of them have some sort of gatekeeping to uphold the values of what is good, right, and true. And so hopefully that was a clarifying idea for us to think about Christianity in that sense, where Jesus gives a radically inclusive call to welcome all who come to him from whatever background of life they come from whatever stratosphere of society they're in. Jesus' power in the gospel is enough for them to also come to God for salvation. All it takes is faith. With that, I know there's often a lot of follow-up questions that we didn't have a chance to get into on Sunday, but hopefully I can address some of them through this short video and podcast. The main one that most people often have in response to that is, why does God have to be so exclusive or narrow with how we live our lives? Or to put it another way, why does God force us to conform to his law? Why are some of his laws so seemingly restrictive over the way people live? Often these will go into questions specifically around sexual ethics, like the LGBTQ ideas, like how we live out even in cohabitation is very common in our society today. Why can't God just love us the way we are and leave us be? And often the objection there is Christianity does not let me be true to who I am. I think we could just answer that in a few ways. First is to just go back to what we talked about in the sermon, that part of the nature of exclusivity is to uphold whatever the group values as good, right, and true. And whatever the group says is good, right, and true, there needs to be some proper excluding of threats to those values to uphold and see the beauty of what is good, right, and true. Every group does this, as we looked at. Liberalism, for instance, one of the clearest ways we're seeing this is that they have been aggressively exclusive to those that are against the trans agenda, that are against the transition of someone's gender beyond their biological sex, because they believe that it's good and true for the individual and even for society to let everyone express their own sexuality and gender as they see fit. And so as we talked about, we've seen that happen. One of the prime examples that I love to look at is in the podcast, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, where she has just been vehemently canceled by the progressive left. And so I think for God to ask his people, his followers, to adhere to a certain standard or values is not exclusive, but rather it's actually quite loving, because God wants us to see the beauty of what is good, right, and true according to his kingdom and his values. So for God to call us to conform to his law and those kingdom ethics and values is actually for our good. I think another way we can answer this is by understanding that the laws in the Old Testament and even the laws that are given or reiterated in the New Testament today, they're not meant to be restrictive. God didn't give his law in a way to say, well, I'm going to prevent humanity from having fun and being happy, and I'm just going to make them miserable and have them deny themselves everywhere they go, because that's what is good for them. But actually, when Jesus gives the call for everyone to follow him, to take up their cross, deny themselves, and follow Jesus, that was a call not into simply a restrictive lifestyle of self-denial, but a call to lay down what C.S. Lewis calls a lesser desire or lesser happiness for the greater desire of kingdom things or heavenly things of God. And so when God calls us to this exclusive way of living, so to speak, it's actually one of the most loving things that God can do. Because in God's love for us, his desire is that we would have a greater revelation and a greater experience of life in abundance and joy, as Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it in abundance. Another place Jesus prays says that I pray that they may have joy and their joy may be filled and filled in me. And so I think one of the things that we have to maybe overcome to understand this in the objection is often this presupposition, this understanding that love should be for someone else's happiness. The height of love is to love someone as they are and to leave them as they are. Or another way we could say it is, the way that love is most expressed is for someone to be most happy. And so to not deny someone their experience of happiness is unloving and mean. And so for God to deny us our own path of what seems to be happy is unloving and mean. But again, God's love is not impotent. God's love is not a love that just leaves us how we are. God's love is powerful. God's love enters into our lives in this world and seeks to transform it and reshape it into his image and into his desire for how creation was intended to be. And so when God establishes his laws for Israel, and when he establishes the laws in the New Testament church for us today, it's out of great love for us to see humanity flourish and thrive, to say that sin is not okay, but there's a greater desire in following him. I think even practically, when we think about how this works out, it tracks. Because if you think about practically, when we think about loving someone, as much as we may say, well, we just want them to be happy, so we're not going to touch their lives. We're not going to intervene. We're not going to mess with what they're doing in their lives, because if happiness is all about this subjective reality or experience for my friend or family member, then for me to be most loving is to leave them be and not intervene. But there are instances where we know that's not true, where someone can be experiencing what in their minds may be happiness, and yet from an external objective standpoint, it is not happiness. We see this when people fall into drug addiction. Maybe it's out of their desire for a happiness to escape reality because it's too hard, and so drug addiction happens. We know it's unloving to leave them as they are. Or another one is eating disorders. In an eating disorder, an individual can say, this is for my happiness to look a certain way, and the path to get there takes suffering, but it's worth it. Whereas those of us on the outside, if we truly love those people stuck in those situations, it would be the most unloving thing for us to say, well, we just want to love them, so we're going to leave them as they are. Rather, love that truly loves the other person even at the expense of our comfort, even at the risk of the potential friendship or relationship, because we desire something better for them. And I think if we can think about or view God's love for us like that it transcends even subjective happiness, we can begin to even reorient the way we define and view happiness. The idea that love is defined by being for someone else's happiness is probably more an American ideal and value than a biblical one. See in the Declaration of Independence and the forming of our nation that the forefathers desired that everyone would have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so that's how happiness and love have almost become synonymous with one another. But from God's perspective, even from our own perspective, we see that happiness can't always be based off someone's subjective reality or experience. And so if happiness can be defined or related to someone else's objective view, then we can also argue that God has the greatest standard or the greatest idea of what our happiness should look like. And if that's the case, then we should listen to God and what he desires for us and for all of humanity, because his love is a powerful love that wants to enter into our lives and the world, to not let sin be okay or tolerated, but to eradicate it for our greater good, both as individuals and a society. This often leads us to a second question. This is just the only second one that I'm going to answer in this video, but it's a big question, and one that often says, well, if that's the case, if God's love is good for the individual and society, and if Christianity is exclusive in some ways, then shouldn't we advocate for Christianity's influence in the public square or the public sphere? Shouldn't we say that Christianity should be advocated for in politics and policies? If the Christian laws and the Christian way of life and standard are really for the good and flourishing of humanity and society, then we should side with the religious right politically. We should advocate for Christians in politics and Christian political policies. This is a huge question, and it dates back decades, if not centuries, throughout the church's debate of how the church engages in the public space. In our 9 a.m. class, we've actually just looked at this with the post-Reformation stage where church and state were beginning to be separated. Many of our forefathers in America came here crying for a separation of church and state. Roger Williams is one of the famous original Baptists who we looked at, who said that a separation of church and state is better for society and Christianity. And if that's the case, and yet people would also argue that if God's laws are good for humanity and society, how do we answer this question? how should Christianity engage in the public square or the public sphere? Again, this is a loaded question, so we can't answer all of it, but I think we can answer it in maybe two different ways. On the one hand, we should be able to say, yes, God's laws are good for human flourishing in society. And if that's the case, then Christians can, with a clear conscience, advocate for policies that uphold Christian values. We can vote in a certain way, we can advocate in a certain way, we can live in a certain way that upholds the kingdom ethics of God, even as we looked at the Sermon on the Mount earlier this year, where Jesus gives us the Beatitudes of all these characteristics and values of human flourishing, as John Pennington says in his book. We should be able to say then that as Christians, yes, we can and we should advocate for those policies that fight for, that uphold, that advance God's beauty and flourishing for his creation. And yet, on the other hand, I think we can say that that doesn't mean then that we have to have a new Christian government. I think we don't have to look very far in our church history to see how when church and state are together or intertwined, that often it breeds corruption in the church, as Leslie Newbegin says, that often it devoids the church of the power of the gospel. One of the things, again, Leslie Newbegin says that I love in that book, The Gospel in a Pluralistic Society, is that almost every time, if not every time, as he examines church history, that the church becomes married with power, the church ends up losing the influence of the power of the gospel. Or to put another way, they've clamored instead, they've chosen instead for power and influence in society over the power and influence of the gospel. Because for them, it became more about influencing the world according to their ideals and being in positions of power and influence, rather than following our Savior, Jesus Christ, who came, as Paul tells us in Philippians, in a lowly human form, who came not in power, but in weakness, and who laid down all of his heavenly might and power so that he would not lead Israel or the disciples into a new throne of power as the Messiah against Rome, but rather he laid it all down and became the Messiah who suffered and was executed by the Roman power. And now in his resurrection, we demonstrate the power of God, not through human or institutional power, but in the power of Christ to raise people from death to life, both in the life to come, but also in the life now as he frees us from sins. And so I would tend to argue or side with Newbegin and others like him who would say that the church is best influential when it lets go of public or institutional influence and power and takes up then this call to see the power of the gospel through their lives. But like I said, again, this is a difficult topic. I think there's validity on both sides. And we can argue that as Christians, we can still desire God's values of his kingdom, his ethics to be known and upheld and believed by our society. And yet we don't have to do so by advocating for and storming buildings or politics with Christian candidates. So I know there's a lot in these topics that we could talk about more. We hope that this may just whet your appetite for more questions. Certainly, if you have more questions, we would love to hear them, although we may not answer them always in a video like this. But hopefully this will also equip you and give you courage to, as we've been seeing this whole series of Explore God, as Peter says, to be able to give a defense for the reason for which we believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, to not shy away from hard conversations with non-believing friends or family, and to be able to really, in a compelling way, stand firm on the truth of the gospel and to show people how, yes, while it may seem exclusive, Jesus' call is radically inclusive, and the power of the gospel can overcome any boundaries for anyone from any place in society or background.